The woman who opened that door was not who Daniel Kowalski expected to find on a Tuesday night in late October. But that detail belongs at the end of the story. Start at the beginning. Stewart Aldgate had worked the same loading dock at Meridian Freight Solutions for 11 years. He was 53 years old, broad across the shoulders, and wore the same kind of plain gray jacket every day, the kind that had no logo and cost $40 at a big box store and lasted a decade if you washed it carefully. His hands were calloused, his boots were steel-toed. He drove a 2009 Ford F-150 with a cracked dashboard and a heater that worked well enough most of the time. None of those things told you anything important about Stewart Aldgate, but people looked at them and decided they did. He had a daughter named Fiona. She was 8 years old and had her mother's cheekbones and Stewart's stubborn streak, which had already gotten her sent to the principal's office twice in the 3rd grade for refusing to back down from arguments she was technically correct about. Stewart had sat across from the principal both times and kept his face very still while quietly agreeing with every point Fiona had made. He raised her alone, not because anyone had asked him to, not because it was easy, but because her mother, Wendy, had died of an aggressive ovarian cancer 3 years earlier, and after that there was no one else. There was Stewart, and there was Fiona, and there was the small house on Greenway Crescent in Oshawa with the leaky eavesdrews he kept meaning to fix, and the backyard that was somehow both too big and too small, depending on the season. He did not talk about Wendy at work. He did not talk much at all. His shift supervisor, a man named Doug Ferris, had once described Stewart to a new hire as the quiet one who shows up and doesn't cause problems. That was meant as a compliment. Stewart understood that. He accepted it as one. He had long ago stopped needing people to understand what he was, because understanding cost time, and time was the one thing he never had enough of. On the night in question, he was working an extra shift. Meridian had taken on a contract with a pharmaceutical distributor out of Mississauga, and 3 of the regular night crew had called in sick, which Stewart privately suspected was less about illness and more about a Raptors game. He had not been asked whether he could stay. Doug had told him, and Stewart had nodded, because Fiona was at her grandmother's that week. Wendy's mother, Elsa, who lived 40 minutes away and took Fiona on the last week of every month, and who had once told Stewart that she did not know many men who would do what he was doing, and that Wendy had been right about him, and because the extra hours would cover the heating bill and part of what the orthodontist had quoted him for Fiona's teeth. He finished at 11:40. He changed out of his work clothes in the locker room, pulled on his jacket, and walked to his truck through the kind of cold that arrives in Ontario in the last week of October and reminds you immediately that you had somehow forgotten what cold actually felt like. He did not usually take the 401. He knew a back route through the industrial section that cut 10 minutes off the drive and avoided the construction near Harmony Road. He took it that night out of habit, not any particular intention, which was the only reason he was on a stretch of poorly lit road behind an outlet mall when he saw her. She was standing under a streetlight, not walking, standing, which was the thing that caught his attention. There was a large planter box at the edge of what had been, at some point, a landscaped strip between the parking lot and the road, and she was holding onto it with one hand in the way people do when the ground is moving beneath them, but the ground is not actually moving. Stewart pulled over. He did not know why entirely. He had driven past people before. He was not the type to stop for every situation that didn't concern him. But there was something specific about the way she was standing, the rigid quality of her grip on the planter box, that pulled at something practical and old in him. The temperature was -3. The road was empty. She was wearing a cream-colored blazer that was not warm enough by a significant margin. He rolled down his window. "You all right?" She turned toward the sound. She was younger than him by at least 15 years. Dark hair pulled back but coming loose at the sides. The kind of clothes that suggested she had come from somewhere formal, or at least from somewhere indoors. She had her phone in her other hand and was holding it at an angle that suggested she had been trying to use it without much success. "My Uber canceled," she said. The words were clear but not quite aligned the way they should have been. Not slurred exactly, but careful. The way people speak when they are concentrating hard on speaking carefully. 3 times. "Where are you going?" She looked down at her phone. "I need to find." She stopped. I'm not entirely sure I can read the address right now. Stewart looked at her for a moment. He looked at the empty road. He looked at the temperature reading on his dashboard. Get in, he said. I'll drive you. She hesitated. He could see her doing the calculation that women do on dark roads near strange men in trucks. The calculation he understood the existence of and didn't resent, because it was a rational calculation. He kept both hands visible on the steering wheel. I'm not going to do anything, he said. You're going to freeze out there. Get in. She got in. Her name, she told him, was Petra. She eventually found the address. A neighborhood in Whitby, north of the lake, the kind of street where the houses were set back from the road and had two-car garages and landscape lighting. She had been at a work function in Pickering, she said, and had stepped outside for air and somehow ended up further from the building than she'd intended, which was not the whole story, but was probably the part she was comfortable sharing with a stranger. Stewart drove. He did not make conversation. He turned the heat up slightly and kept his eyes on the road. At some point, she fell asleep in the passenger seat, which he had half expected. He noted the address she'd shown him on her phone and followed it. The house was at the end of a cul-de-sac. There were lights on, the porch light and what looked like a lamp in the front room. He pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment, then reached over and touched her shoulder, not unkindly. You're home. Petra came awake in stages. She looked at the house. Something moved across her face. Recognition, then something else he couldn't name. Thank you, she said. I'm sorry. I don't. She stopped. What's your name? Stewart. She looked at him in a way that was not quite focused but was trying to be. Thank you, Stewart. She got out carefully, holding the door frame. The front door opened before she reached the steps and a woman appeared in the rectangle of light. The woman was in her mid-50s. She was wearing reading glasses on a chain and a dark cardigan. She had the kind of composure that comes from spending a long time in rooms where composure is required. She looked at Petra, then at the truck, then at Stewart. She needed a ride, Stewart said through the open passenger door. She's all right. The woman looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once. Not warmly, not coolly. Just a single nod that meant she had registered what he'd said and was going to handle the rest herself. Stewart reversed out of the driveway and drove home. He did not think about it much after that. He had a hot shower, ate the bowl of leftover lentil soup he'd had in the refrigerator, and went to bed. Fiona was not home, so the house was quiet in the way that was both restful and slightly wrong. He slept well. He did not think about the woman in the cream blazer, or the woman in the doorway, or the house with the landscape lighting at the end of the cul-de-sac. He thought about the eavesdrops briefly, and then he stopped thinking. That was a Tuesday. On Thursday, he got to work and found out that Meridian Freight Solutions had a new majority shareholder. This was not a total surprise. There had been talk for months. The kind of talk that circulates through a loading dock the way smoke circulates through a room, low and persistent, that the Caldwell family, who owned the parent company, was looking to consolidate. The name he heard on Thursday morning, in the break room, while he was pouring coffee, was Thornwood Capital. He did not know Thornwood Capital by name. He knew enough about capital in the general sense to understand what it usually meant when it arrived. He drank his coffee and went back to work. The announcement came on Friday. All staff, 11 o'clock, the large meeting room on the second floor that was normally used for safety training. Stewart went because he was told to, stood near the back, and listened while the regional manager, a man named Rod Beckett, who always looked slightly startled to find himself in his own body, explained that Thornwood Capital had completed its acquisition and that a senior representative of Thornwood would be on site in the coming weeks to conduct a review. He used the phrase strategic assessment. He used it several times. Stewart had found, over the years, that the number of times the phrase strategic assessment appeared in a speech was inversely proportional to how well things were likely to go for the people listening. But there was nothing to be done. He went back to work. The Thornwood representative arrived the following Wednesday. Stewart found out the way he found out most things at Meridian, not through official announcement, but through the particular quality of tension that moved through the loading dock around 9 in the morning, the way people started straightening things that didn't need straightening and making eye contact less than usual. He was working a pallet of medical supply boxes when Doug appeared beside him. The Thornwood person is doing a walkthrough, Doug said. He said it in a low voice, which was not like Doug. "Okay," Stewart said. "Rod wants the dock looking good." "It already looks fine." "I know," Doug said, and then stood there for another moment before walking away, which told Stewart that Doug was nervous in a way he didn't quite know how to express, and that the nervousness was probably justified. The walkthrough happened mid-morning. Stewart was aware of it at the periphery, a small group moving through the facility, Rod at the front doing the talking, 2 people from head office whose names he didn't know, and someone else, someone walking slightly behind Rod, asking questions that Stewart couldn't quite hear, but that kept causing Rod to stop and turn and consult a clipboard. He did not look up from his work. He had learned in 11 years that the best thing to do during a management walkthrough was to be visibly working, unhurriedly and competently, and to not engage unless engaged. The group moved closer. He heard Rod say, "This is our primary receiving area." And then the group was at the edge of his workspace, and he heard a different voice asking something about turnaround times and third-party logistics compliance, and he set down the scanner he was holding and turned, because that was the appropriate thing to do when management was in proximity. The woman from Thornwood Capital was standing 6 feet away. She was wearing a dark blazer and had her hair pinned up. She was looking at a tablet, and then she looked up at him, and for a moment she was just a representative from a parent company who expected either invisibility or performance. And then something shifted in her face, not dramatically but definitely, the way a door shifts slightly when the air pressure changes. She knew who he was. He did not visibly react. This was not a decision he made. His face simply did the thing it always did, which was very little. Her name was Elaine Thornwood. He learned this 40 minutes later from the printed agenda someone had left in the break room. Not a Thornwood employee. The firm was named for her family. She was not the representative from the parent company. She was the parent company. He finished his shift. On the way to his truck in the parking lot, he heard footsteps behind him. "Stewart." He turned. Elaine Thornwood was standing near the edge of the parking lot, and she had clearly come after him deliberately, which he noted without expression. "You didn't say anything in there," she said. "You were conducting a review," he said. "It didn't seem appropriate." She looked at him for a moment. "How long have you been here?" 11 years. She glanced back at the building. The cold had returned. It had dipped overnight and not recovered. "My daughter told me what you did." She paused. "Not right away, but eventually. I drove her home," he said. "She was cold." Elaine looked at him the same way the woman in the doorway had, with that particular kind of attention that had nothing performative in it, just observation. "I want to talk to you," she said. "Not here. Would you have time this week?" He thought about his schedule. He thought about Fiona, who was home and had hockey practice on Thursday, and a project on Canadian geography due Friday. "Wednesday," he said. "Wednesday," she said, and gave him a card. He took it. He drove home. He put the card on the kitchen table and helped Fiona with the geography project, and did not mention to anyone that he had spoken to the new majority shareholder of his employer in a parking lot on a Tuesday evening in November. What followed was not simple. A man named Curtis Madden, who was the operations manager and had been at Meridian for 7 years, had seen the exchange in the parking lot. Curtis Madden was the kind of person who existed in every workplace, the kind who understood leverage instinctively, who cataloged interactions and their potential implications the way other people cataloged hockey statistics. He was not malicious in the cartoonish sense. He was ambitious in a way that required the occasional removal of obstacles. On Thursday morning, Curtis went to Rod Beckett and told him that Stewart Aldgate had followed the Thornwood representative into the parking lot after the walkthrough and engaged her in what looked like an extended personal conversation. The word he used was inappropriate. He used it twice, and each time he used it, he let a small silence sit after it, the way you let a stone sit in water before the ripples. Rod called Stewart into his office on Friday morning. Stewart sat across from Rod in the chair that had a slightly uneven leg, which he'd noticed the first time he'd ever sat in it, years ago. Rod had a piece of paper in front of him and was looking at it in a way that suggested he wasn't really reading it. "There was a concern raised," Rod said. "Okay," Stewart said. "About your interaction with the Thornwood representative after the walkthrough. She stopped me in the parking lot," Stewart said. "She spoke to me." "There's a feeling that it might have been." Rod paused, looking for the word. She spoke to me, Stewart repeated. Rod looked at his piece of paper. He was not a bad man, in Stewart's estimation. He was a man who had spent his career avoiding friction, which had served him well enough, and which was now causing him difficulty because the source of friction was unclear and the ground was shifting beneath him. "I'm not saying it was your doing," Rod said finally. "I'm just letting you know that it was noted." Stewart looked at him steadily. "Is there anything else?" "No," Rod said. "That's all." Stewart went back to work. What he did not know, because there was no reason he would have known it, was that Elaine Thornwood had requested Stewart's personnel file that same morning. Not through Rod, not through HR in the usual chain. Directly through the administrative coordinator she had brought with her from Thornwood, a quiet and efficient woman named Greta, who had worked for the family for 12 years, and who did not explain her requests, only made them. Elaine had spent Wednesday reviewing facility records. She had spent Thursday on calls. But on Friday morning, before anything else, she had thought about what Petra had told her, haltingly, and in pieces the way Petra told her most things, because they were working on that, and she had requested the file. What she found was straightforward and unremarkable in the way that genuinely good records are unremarkable. 11 years of service. No disciplinary actions. Performance reviews that used words like reliable, methodical, no issues noted. A single commendation, 6 years back, written by a supervisor who had since retired, for correctly identifying a temperature control failure in a pharmaceutical shipment before it was distributed. The commendation had not been followed by a promotion. She read that twice. She found out about the parking lot conversation not from Rod, but from Greta, who had ways of finding out things. She found out that Curtis Madden had been to see Rod before she did. She sat with that information for a moment, and then she moved on, because she was not a woman who spent long on indignation when there was work to be done. On Wednesday, Stewart arrived at the address on the card, which turned out to be a conference room at a hotel in Whitby, not the house at the end of the cul-de-sac, which he had not expected it to be. There was coffee already made, which he noted with the kind of appreciation he didn't express out loud. Elaine was already there. She had a notebook open in front of her, and was writing when he came in, and she finished the sentence before she looked up, which he recognized as the habit of someone who did not like leaving things unfinished. She asked him about the temperature control incident. She asked him about the pharmaceutical contract, specifically the transition period when 3 crew members were absent. She asked him what he would do differently about the third bay receiving procedure if the decision were his. These were not the questions of someone looking for confirmation of what she already thought. They were the questions of someone who genuinely didn't know and wanted to. He answered them plainly. He had opinions about the third bay procedure. He had held them for 4 years and said them, on one occasion, to Doug, who had agreed and then not done anything with it. He said them now without editorializing, just the practical observation, the reasoning, the likely outcome of a change. She wrote in her notebook at the end, she said, "I want to be straightforward with you about something." "All right," he said. "I know about the conversation Rod Beckett had with you." He said nothing. "I also know who initiated that conversation and why." She set down her pen. "I'm not going to pretend that the situation isn't complicated. You did something for my daughter on a road at night when she needed help, and now I'm the majority shareholder of your employer. That is complicated." "It is," he said. "What I can tell you is that I'm not here because of that." The acquisition was already complete. The review was already scheduled. She looked at him evenly. "I requested your file because of what Petra told me. What I found is what made me want to talk to you." He looked at her across the table. He was thinking about Fiona, about the eavesdrops, about the particular quality of fatigue that comes from 11 years of doing good work in a place that calls it no issues noted. "What are you offering?" he said. She almost smiled. "I haven't decided yet, but I'm looking at the operation structure, and I want to bring someone into a logistics coordination role at the divisional level." She paused. "It would require a change of scope, possibly some training, which we would provide. I have a daughter," he said. "She's 8. The schedule would need to be something I could work around." "Tell me what that looks like," she said. He told her. She listened with the pen down, which he noticed. She did not write anything during that part. She just listened. He drove home afterward through the early dark of November, the kind of dark that arrives in southern Ontario like it means business and doesn't leave until March. Fiona was at her after-school program until 5:30. He had 40 minutes before he needed to pick her up. He drove without the radio. He thought about the commendation that had not become a promotion. He thought about 6 years ago, and 4 years ago, and 2 years ago, and all the points along the 11 years where something might have changed and didn't. He thought about Wendy, who had believed stubbornly and without evidence that quiet integrity was its own kind of accumulation, that doing the right thing in the small moments added up to something, even when you couldn't see it. He had not believed her entirely. He had wanted to. There was a difference. He was still not sure. But the commendation had been read. The file had been found. Someone had looked at the record and seen it for what it actually was, not for what was convenient to see. That was not nothing. Curtis Madden's name came up once more, about a week later, in a conversation between Elaine's administrative coordinator and the regional HR department. Greta was not dramatic about these things. She simply noted that a formal record had been made of the information Curtis had provided to Rod Beckett and the circumstances surrounding it, and that Thornwood's policy on interference with personnel matters during an acquisition review was clear, and that Rod might want to have a conversation with his operations manager about the difference between raising a genuine concern and using one to shape a narrative. Rod had that conversation. Curtis spent the next month very busy with very detailed inventory audits that required him to be in the warehouse from 7 in the morning until well past his usual departure time. Stewart started the new role in January. The title was Divisional Logistics Coordinator, which meant very little to most people he knew and a great deal in practice. The salary was nearly double. The hours were structured around something resembling a normal working day. He told Fiona about it on a Saturday morning while she was eating cereal and reading a book about the history of the Trans-Canada Highway, which she had checked out of the library herself. "Will you still have to go in at night?" she asked. "No," he said. She nodded, turned a page, and ate another spoonful of cereal. Then she looked up. "Will you have more time?" "Yes," he said. She turned back to her book. After a moment she said, "We should fix the eave straws." "We will," he said. "You said that in August, I know. And September, Fiona. I'm just noting a pattern," she said. He did not say anything, but something moved in his chest that was not quite a laugh and not quite grief, and was perhaps, more accurately, the feeling of recognizing yourself in another person and being grateful they exist. He fixed the eavesdrows in April, on a Saturday, while Fiona held the ladder and told him about a disagreement she'd had with her teacher, about the migratory patterns of Canada geese, that she felt she had won on points, but not technically on record. He listened. The sky above Oshawa was the specific pale blue that only arrives in spring in this part of the country. The blue that means the worst is genuinely over, that what is coming will be different from what came before. He climbed back down the ladder. He looked at the eave straws, which were level and properly secured and would direct water away from the foundation the way they were supposed to. He looked at Fiona, who was looking at her notes about Canada geese with the expression of someone who was not finished making her case. "You're right," he said, "about the geese." She looked up. "I know," she said, "but it's good that you said it." He gathered the tools. The neighbor's dog was barking at something in the yard next door. A car went past on the street. Somewhere down the block, someone was burning a brush pile, that particular smell of early spring in a Canadian neighborhood, dry wood and last year's leaves. He put the ladder away. He made lunch. The house on Greenway Crescent was not a different house than it had been a year ago, but the people inside it were, in the particular way that change happens when you aren't looking, not in the dramatic moments, not in the offices with the conference room coffee and the notebook and the pen going down to listen, but in the ordinary accumulation of mornings, of meals, of problems approached steadily and without flinching, of a child holding a ladder in a pale blue April and telling you, patiently, what she knows.